India and Canada simply don't trust each other on Khalistan and terrorism. That much has become clear after the two countries have wrecked their relationship over the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar on Canadian soil last year. Canada accused India's government of involvement in Nijjar's death, and India believes that Canada is supporting Khalistani extremists. But there's a deeper story to this crisis. An incident 40 years ago explains why India and Canada simply do not trust each other on Khalistan. That incident was the 1985 Air India Kanishka bombing, carried out by Khalistani extremists. India warned Canada about the bombing, only to be ignored. The cost was over 300 lives. On this episode of Threadbare, we tell you about how Canada's intelligence agencies let the 1985 Air India Kanishka bombing happen, despite Indian warnings. We also tell you how Canada's police and investigative agencies repeatedly failed to bring the bombers to justice. On June 23, 1985, Air India Flight 182, also known as Air India Kanishka, was flying from Toronto to London when it exploded mid-air. A bomb placed in the plane's baggage hold caused the explosion. All 329 people on board, including Indians, as well as a large number of Canadian citizens of Indian origin, were killed. It was the worst terrorist attack in Canadian history. On the same day, another bomb targeted at an Air India flight exploded in Japan, killing 2 people. Fairly soon, it was clear that pro-Khalistan groups in Canada were suspected of carrying out both bombings. At the time, India was fighting a gradually increasing campaign of terror by Khalistani groups, who wanted to carve out an independent Sikh state in India. As India fought this battle, it was looking for international cooperation with Canada, which had become home to some Khalistani extremists that threatened India's security. But Canada refused to help. But here's the problem. Canada's government was actually warned by India about threats to Air India Kanishka. Weeks before the attack, Air India's security manager in Mumbai sent a message to Canadian agencies saying that its flights could be sabotaged by a bomb in a suitcase. That, incidentally, is exactly what happened to Air India Kanishka. But according to journalist Terry Milewski, Canada's agencies ignored the warning totally. What's worse, Canada's government actually knew about the attack a year before it happened. In August 1984, an informant told the Canadian police that he had been offered money by Sikh men to bomb an Air India flight in Canada. Then another source told police that he had heard about a specific plot against Air India. And finally, in 1985, the head of intelligence analysis for Canada's foreign ministry saw a specific report about a threat to the Air India Kanishka flight on the weekend of 22nd, 23rd June 1985. That, incidentally, is exactly when the bombing happened. He brought up the report with police officials who dismissed it. But India's distrust of Canada only increased after it became clear that pro-Khalistan groups carried out the bombing. So at one level, Canadian agencies simply failed to stop the attack. But India's distrust of Canada only increased after it became clear that certain pro-Khalistan groups had carried out the bombing. Canada arrested 2 suspects soon after, pro-Khalistan extremist Talvinder Singh Parmar and Inderjeet Singh Rayat. Parmar was the leader of the Babbar Khalsa, a Khalistani group, while Rayat was a mechanic. India's government had once requested Canada to extradite Parmar to India, calling him a dangerous and violent terrorist. This request was refused. But like India, Canada's government was also suspicious of Parmar. He had been placed under surveillance by Canada months before the Kanishka bombing. In fact, for years, Canada's security and intelligence agencies said that they had not received a warning about the Air India Kanishka bombing attack. But in fact, Canada's intelligence agency CSIS had recordings of Parmar, which indicated that he might have had a role in the attack. In the months before the June 1985 bombing, CSIS had already had suspicions about Parmar's involvement in terrorism. Its agents even followed Inderjeet Singh Rayat and Parmar into a forest, where the 2 men conducted a large test explosion. Despite this, there was no follow-up on this evidence. Canada's agencies knew that Rayat and Parmar visited a Gurudwara in Toronto and told people not to fly on Air India. But they didn't share this information. And in the subsequent prosecution, Talvinder Singh Parmar was let go as there was little evidence to implicate him in the bombing of Air India Kanishka. He continued his terrorist activities and was eventually killed in a firefight with the Indian police in the early 1990s. It is also later in the 1990s that Inderjeet Singh Rayat was found guilty of the second Air India bombing that took place in Japan. But that was only because of the efforts of Japan's security agencies. Having failed to stop the attack, Canada's entire police and judicial system also failed to secure justice for the bombing victims. After all, it was only in 2003, 15 years after the Air India Kanishka bombing, that a trial to prosecute those responsible actually began. 2 men were charged with the bombings. First is Ajay Bagri, a follower of Parmar and part of the Pro-Khalistan Babar Khalsa. He was accused of getting the bomb into Air India Kanishka in the first place, using his luggage. The second accused is Riputaman Malik, a rich businessman who was accused of planning the plot. In 2003, the trial of Malik and Bagri began. And once again, the evidence against them was strong. One witness in the trial said that Bagri had asked to borrow her car to take some bags to the airport just before the bombing. Bagri had told her that he returned with the car, but not with the bags. The witness refused, and after the Kanishka bombing, she realized that Bagri was involved in the incident. She confronted Bagri, who then threatened to kill her. Another witness said Riputaman Malik confessed to her that he had carried out the bombing. But despite all of this, Canada messed up the prosecution. One big problem, of course, was the deletion of evidence inexplicably. For months before and after the 1985 bombing, Canadian agencies had placed wiretaps on Talwinder Parmar, who was, as you might remember, initially arrested for the bombing. But it turned out that hundreds of these tapes had been deleted without an explanation. And to this day, it remains unexplained by Canadian intelligence agencies. These tapes could have had evidence linking the accused Bagri and Malik to the crimes, but their deletion damaged the case to prosecute the two men. Canada's agencies were instead condemned for unacceptable negligence. Second, key witnesses in the case were not properly protected by Canada's government. For example, journalist Tara Singh Hayar stated that he had personally heard Bagri claim credit for the Kanishka bombing at a private gathering. Despite attempts on his life, Hayar continued to speak out against Bagri and other Khalistani extremists. He was finally murdered in 1998. Key witnesses felt that Canada's government could not protect them from Khalistani groups and refused to come forward in the case. The result of these errors, both Malik and Bagri were acquitted of all charges in 2005, 20 years after the bombing. This led to a wave of anger against the Canadian government by the families of the Air India bombing victims, as well as condemnation in India. A judicial inquiry was appointed in 2006 to review the investigation, and it slammed Canadian agencies for their failures to stop and properly investigate the 1985 bombings. It was only months later that Canada's Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologized to the families of the bombing victims for all that had happened to them. Canada's failures left many in India convinced that its government was not really serious about fighting Khalistani terrorism. Through the years, that belief is only solidified, as Justin Trudeau's government refused Indian extradition requests for criminals, refused to name Khalistani extremism as a public safety threat, and refused to work with the Indian government on these key issues. The events of the last few weeks, which have wrecked the India-Canada relationship, are simply the latest in a 40-year clash of disagreements, anger, and disillusion between India and Canada. Thank you so much for watching Threadbare with me, Shashank Matu. You can catch our show again next week only on India Today Global.